December 11, 1941. Adolf Hitler stood before a nation and before a world that in his mind was already measured and found wanting. He declared war on the United States with the same certainty he applied to every strategic judgment, a conviction rooted less in empirical calculation than in an ordered worldview. To him, America was a democracy of mixed bloods and soft habits, a mongrel society of shopkeepers and financiers, unlikely to possess either the will or the industrial discipline to sustain a long, hard contest. That declaration was not merely a political step, it was a wager made from the top of an ideological house of cards. It was the moment when he committed Germany to a confrontation whose most decisive components he still refused to see. If one moment marks the turning point of that miscalculation, it is not a single report or a single battle. It is a slow, accumulating recognition, a sequence of hard evidence that one by one contradicted the assumptions on which Hitler had based his gamble. Convoys crossing the Atlantic, a ship built in 7 days, depots overflowing in the sands of North Africa, charts and photographs compiled by Albert Speer, bomber streams that grew in size and persistence, the beaches of Normandy and the logistics lined behind them. Taken together, these were the facts that eventually forced the question on Hitler's understanding of American power. He came to see it. It was simply too late. Hitler's strategic lens was shaped by race and hierarchy. He believed strength flowed from racial purity, martial tradition, and centralized will. Democracies, in his calculus, betrayed indecisiveness and inefficiency, qualities he assumed would translate into military inferiority. That prejudice made his decision to extend the war to America appear to him manageable. He would secure the East against the Soviet Union and then, if need be, handle the Western democracies. Declaring war on the United States was therefore not an admission of weakness, but an assertion of superiority. The assumption that American industrial society would be slow to mobilize and incapable of sustained offensive power. This was not merely arrogance, it was a fundamental error of perception. Ideology narrowed Hitler's categories, forcing him to underestimate the capacity of an industrial economy that operated differently from the centralized, hierarchical German war machine he imagined. Democracy's bureaucratic messiness translated, in American terms, into a kind of improvisational flexibility. Private industry could be repurposed. Small firms could be rapidly integrated into a national effort. Local innovations scaled nationwide. The question was not whether Americans loved war, they did not, but whether their factories, their engineers, and their logistics specialists could outpace expectations. The emerging evidence answered that question. Then the convoys surprised them. German U-boat commanders reported an unexpected reality. The Atlantic routes were no longer simply trickles of supplies stretched thin by Allied escort limitations. Convoys grew larger. Shipments continued despite losses. Each submarine report carried the same uneasy refrain. Sinkings were terrible for those lost, but they did not translate into strategic strangulation. Merchant ships kept crossing, yards kept building hulls, and another convoy was always on the way. Where Hitler expected attrition to force a halt, endurance and industrial capacity sustained momentum. The Liberty Ship program became perhaps the most visible symbol of that endurance. Born of necessity and scaled by industrial creativity, these cargo vessels were designed for rapid, economical construction. The most famous emblem of the program's speed was the SS Robert E. Peary, assembled in a city-ready frenzy, its hull put together in 7 days.
That was not a single publicity stunt. It was demonstrative of a production system that had adapted mass production techniques to shipbuilding in an entirely new way. Prefabricated sections, assembly line processes, and a dispersed labor force that could be brought into the work. By the end of 1942, roughly 700 Liberty ships had been launched. By war's end, the program produced approximately 2,700 of them. For German observers, this was almost inconceivable. The idea that merchant fleets could be replaced at such scale undermined assumptions that sinking shipping would necessarily collapse logistical support. The Liberty ships were not glamorous warships. They were basic, functional instruments of supply. Yet their numbers and the speed of their construction made the Atlantic convoys less a matter of temporary advantage and more a demonstration of a sustainable industrial war economy. The flow of men, materiel, fuel, and food could be renewed, and the renewal itself was industrial muscle turned into strategic leverage. Then a single depot told a different story. In North Africa, the pattern repeated with local flair. The Desert Campaign is often narrated in terms of maneuver, supply lines, and the harsh arithmetic of fuel and water. For German officers on the ground, however, one of the most disorienting discoveries came not from a grand battle so much as from captured stocks. Colonel Hans von Luke and other field commanders encountered depots and abandonments that revealed abundance. Trucks stacked in orderly rows, ammunition crates intact, spare parts stored in numbers that suggested not scarcity but prepared redundancy. Men who had expected the thin supply lines of a tired democracy instead found warehouses that allowed American forces to retreat, regroup, and return with fresh vehicles and ammunition. That logistic resilience had two sources. First, American military planners, learning rapidly from each engagement, improved their tactical supply and repair systems.
Second, and more fundamental, was the raw industrial output that fed those systems. Automakers and civilian factories were retooled. Production lines were repurposed to create the very equipment that sustained frontline operations. The German reaction was immediate. Stunned officers, baffled reports, and an uneasy realization that battlefield setbacks for the Allies did not equal systemic breakdown. Americans were suffering losses, but they had a capacity to replace and adapt that Germany lacked. Then, charts and photographs began to speak. Albert Speer, as armaments minister, had access to a widening body of evidence, captured documents, interrogations, aerial reconnaissance, and raw production data. Speer did not present his findings as mere anecdotes. He compiled numbers, tables, photographs of sprawling factories, and testimonies that pointed to a conversion on an unprecedented scale. Automakers that had once produced civilian cars were now producing aircraft and tanks. Plants like Willow Run, run by Ford, became emblematic of this conversion. At its peak, Willow Run's assembly lines were producing B-24 Liberator heavy bombers at a rate measured not in weeks, but in minutes. Roughly one completed bomber about every 63 minutes. Speer's reports were not merely quantitative, they were structural. They showed not only that production had increased, but how it had been organized, dispersed yet coordinated, decentralized but unified by contracts, and backed by a powerful logistical network. Factories multiplied the output of critical resources such as aluminum and engines, and these supplies fed forward into ever larger formations in the field and in the air. For commanders and politicians who believed in centralized planning as the only effective method, the American model, chaotic on paper, efficient in practice, was an uncomfortable revelation. Hitler, when presented with such evidence, moved through predictable stages: dismissal, anger, and finally a begrudging acknowledgement. He would rail against numbers, accuse sources of inflation, or claim sabotage, but the data persisted.
It was not a single document that changed the trajectory so much as the cumulative weight of conversion. Cars turned into tanks, assembly line innovations applied to aircraft, and an industrial reserve so large that losses could be replaced. Where ideology had clouded his vision, hard accounting pierced the veil. Then came the air war, where the translation from production to operational effect was unmistakable. American bomber production multiplied the effect of factory output. B-17s and B-24s did not only strike at targets, by their numbers they forced a strategic attrition on the Luftwaffe that Germany could not match. The streams of bombers that crossed to targets in Germany and occupied Europe increased in size year by year. What had begun as dozens became hundreds, then thousands in terms of sorties and squadrons, contributing to sustained pressure. German pilot training and replacement could not keep pace. The Luftwaffe's losses in men and planes mounted, and the pool of experienced flyers, the kind of aircrew whose training and combat seasoning made a qualitative difference, dwindled. American production, by contrast, created a steady flow of replacement aircraft and crews. Where German wartime planning had assumed quality could overcome quantity, the reality of sustained industrial-scale bombing campaigns exposed that calculation as insufficient. The ratio of American aircraft production to German output in 1943 was roughly 3-to-1, a gap that translated directly into operational leverage and the ability to absorb losses and continue pressing. The practical implication was simple and devastating from Germany's perspective. The Allies were not fighting a series of isolated surges. They were exercising a continuous, machine-like pressure that could be refreshed daily. Air power, supplied from an ever larger industrial base, became an instrument not just of destruction, but of operational permanence. It enabled campaigns that relied less on decisive single battles and more on grinding superiority maintained over months and years. Then the beaches made it undeniable. Normandy in 1944 was more than an amphibious operation. It was a logistical spectacle that turned production and planning into a visible humming machine. Men and materiel did not simply cross an ocean and fight. They crossed a logistical threshold that linked factory to foxhole in a choreography of supply. Artificial harbors were towed into place. Fuel pipelines were laid across the channel. Daily tonnages of supplies flowed ashore, and a transportation network inland, trucks, railheads, temporary depots, distributed material to advancing units. The size of the initial assault and the pace at which it was reinforced and supplied transformed the invasion from a gamble into a steadily expanding foothold. To those on the German side, Normandy was the clarifying moment. The picture assembled in aerial photography and field reports was not of isolated heroism, but of a system working as designed. American factories were producing the tools. American docks and railways were moving them. American logisticians were sustaining them. Colonel Hans von Luck, who had seen the desert depots and fought in numerous engagements, would later note the cumulative impression of seeing such a scale brought to bear. Strategically, what mattered was not the bravery or skill of individual soldiers alone, but the way a society's industrial and logistical capacity multiplied their efforts into an overwhelming stream. When Hitler finally acknowledged the reality, his recognition carried the weight of failure. By the time he admitted, between council and outburst, the magnitude of the American industrial machine, the temporal axis of the war had already shifted. Production had been converted into material reality, armor on the ground, planes in the air, supplies at the front. The transformation was not a sudden lightning bolt. It was a process that, from the German perspective, moved inexorably from surprise to understanding. That understanding was real, but as an operational fact, it was too late to reverse the systemic advantages the Allies had already put in motion. The moral of this sequence is not that material power alone determines outcomes in war. Courage, leadership, tactical brilliance, and political decisions matter. Battles are not decided in factories any more than factories are decisive without men to use what they produce. But in the era of industrial total war, production and logistics assume primacy as amplifiers. The capacity to produce men and material and to sustain them far from home through complex supply chains can bend strategic possibilities into new alignments. There is a cautionary political lesson in Hitler's misreading. Ideology, however fervent, is a dangerous substitute for empirical judgment. A closed system of thought that begins by categorizing entire societies as inherently weak or unfit risks discounting the very phenomena by which power in the modern world accrues. Hitler's racial and cultural prejudices occluded an assessment of American industrial dynamism. He saw only what his categories permitted, a decadent, mongrel society bound to fail. When faced with evidence to the contrary, his reaction skewed from denial to fury rather than systematic correction. This is not to speak neutrally of Germany's failures. It is to insist on moral clarity. The ideological framework that blinded Hitler was not merely mistaken, it was wicked. Its contempt for human life, its racist violence, and its aspirations for domination were crimes of the gravest order. An analytical account of why his strategic judgments failed cannot and must not soften that reality. The lesson is double-edged. Ideological blindness produces both moral atrocity and operational disaster. There are other lessons, institutional and organizational, that follow. The American model in wartime had advantages that authoritarian command structures did not have: a distributed industrial base that could innovate at multiple points, a system of contract incentives that brought private industry into public purpose, and a flexible logistical culture that turned improvisation into repeatable practice. These were not virtues uniquely American in an ethical sense. They were operational features of a pluralistic, market-oriented society that could be harnessed to wartime objectives. Centralized regimes can concentrate force quickly, but they often lack the adaptive substrate that lets a factory floor retool overnight or a small contractor scale production regionally. Albert Speer's insights capture this structural contrast.
As he gathered reports from occupied territories, interrogations of prisoners, and aerial photographs, he could see the architecture of American production. His ministrations to Hitler, charts laid out, images shown, testimonies filed, were evidence in an administrative language the Reich had once used with confidence. When the evidence contradicted ideological premises, it forced a cognitive realignment. But even Speer's ability to measure and report could not reverse the strategic momentum that production and logistics had already built. The sequence of clues, Atlantic convoys, Liberty ships, North African depots, Speer's statistics, bomber streams, Normandy logistics, was instructive beyond its immediate wartime context. It spoke to the growing importance of systems thinking and strategy. The modern battlefield is not merely a stage for decisive maneuvers. It is a theater where industrial output, supply networks, and maintenance cycles constitute an invisible front in their own right. Commanders who ignore that front do so at incalculable risk. Hitler's case is an archetype of what happens when a leader's worldview is not continuously checked against material reality.
He made a choice, then marshaled rhetoric and policy to fit that choice. Each unexpected convoy, each newly built hull, each abandoned depot contradicted the narrative and should have prompted a reassessment. Instead, those facts accumulated like a slow tide against a shore of dogma until the inundation was complete. The final point to draw is strategic humility. The Allies won many kinds of battles, tactical, operational, and political, but one of the decisive advantages they exercised was mundane and repetitive, their ability to produce, ship, and sustain. Industry, when connected to planning and logistics, is lethal in a modern conflict, not because it decides individual fights, but because it creates a margin that lets strategy breathe, innovate, and endure under pressure. Hitler's failure to account for that margin, to reduce his analysis to prejudice rather than data, was both tragic and predictable. When he did grasp the scope of American power, the scale, the tempo, the adaptability, his expression was not of admiration, but of stunned resentment. It was a recognition bought at a price measured in territory lost, front lines breached, and millions dead. The facts that forced that recognition had been visible for years in convoy manifests, in shipyards, in mountains of captured materiel, in Speer's reports, and finally on the beaches of Normandy. Each clue had been, in isolation, insufficient to overturn conviction. Together, they formed a narrative too coherent to deny.
If there is a single sentence that ties this all back to the title, it is this: the moment Hitler grasped America's true power was not the instant of his declaration of war, but the slow, accumulating confrontation with a different kind of national strength, an industrial and logistical system that transformed production into strategic endurance. That realization arrived. It did not save him. It arrived too late to bend the outcome. History rarely offers tidy moral conclusions, but it does offer warnings. Leaders who interpret the world primarily through ideology risk blinding themselves to instruments of power that operate beyond rhetoric. Conversely, societies that can convert technical capacity into sustained logistical advantage gain an operational resilience that can be decisive. For students of strategy, for citizens who read the past to better steer the future, the lesson is clear. Number and supply chains matter. Facts matter. And when those facts contradict a leader's ideological script, it is better to change the script than to double down on error. If this account has made you want to dig deeper into the archival evidence, the reports, and the memoirs that document these moments, check the description for sources and a recommended reading list. There you will find the primary materials and detailed studies that trace the convoy reports, the Liberty Ship program, Speer's wartime files, Willow Run's production history, von Luck's field reports, and the logistics of the Normandy campaign. Watch the next episode in this series to follow how industrial policy shaped other theaters of the war and how logistics became the silent engine of victory. In the end, the narrative is as much a cautionary tale as it is a strategic study. Hitler declared war driven by prejudice. The war answered with production lines, shipyards, and supply trains he had refused to count. That refusal changed the course of the 20th century, and the moment he recognized America's true power stands as a testimony to the practical primacy of industry and logistics over ideological certainty.